Nestled in the shadowed hills of Los Angeles, the house once belonging to Vincent Price, the legendary master of macabre cinema, had earned a chilling reputation. Locals whispered its nickname, the Ghost Palace. Decades after Price's death, the property remained a looming mystery, its Gothic arches and shadow-filled windows daring anyone to approach. For years, the house sat vacant, its iron gates rusting and gardens choking with weeds. But when Tom and Maggie Prescott, a young couple eager to renovate the historic property, purchased it, they dismissed the warnings of neighbors. Ghosts don't pay the bills, Tom had joked, though Maggie often shivered at the peculiar shadows that seemed to cling to the house even in daylight. From the moment the Prescotts moved in, small, unnerving occurrences unsettled them. Doors creaked open by themselves, and faint whispers seemed to emanate from nowhere. The couple chalked it up to the old house's quirks until Maggie found the journal. It was hidden in a hollowed-out section of the library wall, bound in cracked leather and smelling of damp decay. The entries were scrawled in a hurried hand that grew increasingly illegible. Price had written it himself. "I fear this house no longer belongs to me," one entry read. "There is something here watching, waiting. It moves between the walls, mocking my performances. I am not the master of this house. I am its prisoner." Maggie's heart raced as she read further, each line revealing Price's belief that the house had a will of its own. It fed on fear, Price wrote, thriving on the dark energy his films had conjured. His final entry ended abruptly, the mirrors. That night, Maggie shared the journal with Tom, who dismissed it as Price's flair for drama. But later, as they prepared for bed, Maggie noticed something odd. The mirror above their dresser didn't reflect the room as it should. The shadows behind them seemed deeper, moving independently of the light. "I think there's something wrong with the mirrors," Maggie whispered. Tom scoffed but agreed to take a closer look. As he stepped closer, the mirror fogged over, as though someone on the other side was breathing heavily. Then, with a sound like shattering ice, a hand pressed against the glass from the inside. Tom stumbled back, but the hand disappeared as quickly as it appeared. They decided to cover the mirrors that night, convinced their minds were playing tricks. The next few days brought more terror. Maggie swore she saw figures in her peripheral vision, always near reflective surfaces, windows, polished floors, the mirrored backsplash in the kitchen. Meanwhile, Tom began sleepwalking, always heading to the basement, where the air was unnaturally cold and damp. Finally, one stormy night, as thunder rolled across the city, they decided to confront the basement. Armed with flashlights, they descended the creaking stairs. The room below was barren, except for an enormous mirror leaning against the far wall. Its surface rippled like water as they approached, and suddenly, they saw him, Vincent Price, standing just on the other side, his face frozen in a twisted scream. Behind him, dozens of other faces crowded the glass, their eyes wide with terror, mouths moving silently as if begging for release. Suddenly, Tom lunged toward the mirror, his eyes vacant. Maggie screamed, grabbing his arm, but the pull from the mirror grew stronger. It wasn't until she smashed the glass with an old candlestick that the spell broke. The mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces, the faces within disappearing with a piercing wail. Thinking they were finally free, the couple left the house the next morning, vowing never to return. But as they drove away, Maggie glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. There, sitting in the back seat, was Vincent Price, his eyes glinting with cruel amusement. "You can never leave," he whispered. The car veered off the road, its horn blaring one long, mournful note as the neighbors rushed to the scene. By the time help arrived, the car was empty. The Prescotts had vanished, leaving behind only their reflections in the shattered glass of the rearview mirror. Months passed, and the Prescotts' disappearance became a chilling urban legend. Some claimed they saw the couple wandering the grounds of the Ghost Palace at night, their faces pale and devoid of life. Others swore they heard Maggie's desperate screams echoing through the hills during stormy evenings. The house, now an object of morbid fascination, attracted thrill-seekers and ghost hunters alike, few of whom ever returned with their courage intact. One night, A local historian named Emily Grant decided to investigate the property. Emily had dedicated years to studying Hollywood's forgotten past and couldn't resist the lure of Vincent Price's home. Armed with an old Polaroid camera, a tape recorder, and Price's journal, she ventured into the house under the cover of darkness. As Emily crossed the threshold, the air grew heavy, thick with the scent of mildew and something metallic blood. She thought, though she saw none. The house seemed alive, its wood creaking and sighing like an ancient beast settling into its lair. The mirrors, now cracked and smeared with grime, were everywhere. They reflected warped versions of the dimly lit rooms, stretching shadows into grotesque forms. Emily avoided them, recalling Price's warnings, but her camera refused to work unless aimed at their shimmering surfaces. Reluctantly, she began taking photographs. Each snap of the Polaroid filled the house with a harsh white light, momentarily dispelling the darkness. But when the photos developed, they showed things Emily couldn't see with her own eyes: figures standing behind her, faces peering from corners, and, in one, Vincent Price himself, his face unervingly close to hers. Her heart pounding, Emily followed the faint hum of static to the basement. The door opened on its own, groaning as if in protest. Descending into the cold, damp space, she found the shattered remains of the mirror the Prescotts had destroyed. Something glimmered among the shards, catching her flashlight's beam. It was a small silver key. Gripping it tightly, Emily scanned the room, looking for its match. Her eyes landed on a narrow door she hadn't noticed before. The wood was warped and blackened, as though scorched in a fire, and the keyhole seemed to pulse faintly, almost like a heartbeat. Against her better judgment, she inserted the key. The lock clicked with an unnatural echo, and the door swung open to reveal a narrow, spiraling staircase descending into blackness. A chill swept over her, and she hesitated, torn between retreating to safety and uncovering the truth. Gathering her courage, Emily stepped through the doorway. The staircase seemed to stretch on forever, the air growing colder with each step. At the bottom, she found herself in a narrow hallway lined with mirrors, each reflecting not her own face but a different person, some crying, some screaming, others frozen in blank terror. The last mirror on the left shimmered brighter than the rest, drawing her like a moth to flame. As she approached, she realized it wasn't a reflection at all but a window into another place, another time. Inside the mirror, she saw Vincent Price seated at a desk, his pen moving furiously across a piece of paper. He looked up suddenly, his eyes locking onto hers as if he could see her. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice resonating through the hall. The mirrors around her began to vibrate violently, and the hallway filled with a deafening hum. Desperate, Emily turned to flee, but the path behind her had vanished. The hallway was endless now, mirrors stretching infinitely in both directions. Her breathing quickened as the mirrors began to warp, their surfaces melting like liquid glass. Faces emerged from the distortions, whispering her name in unison. One voice, louder than the rest, cut through the cacophony. "Break the cycle." Emily turned back to the glowing mirror. Vincent Price stood now, his hands pressed against the glass, his face filled with something unexpected, pleading. But before she could act, the hallway plunged into darkness, leaving Emily alone with the sound of her own pounding heart and the faintest whisper behind her. "Run. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story." Emily froze, her flashlight flickering as the whisper lingered in the suffocating silence. She spun around, heart pounding, but the hallway was empty, or so it seemed. The mirrors, though still and silent, seemed to watch her, their surfaces faintly rippling as if alive. She turned back to the glowing mirror where Vincent Price had stood just moments before. It was blank now, reflecting only her pale, trembling face. Yet the words, "break the cycle," echoed in her mind. What cycle? What did he mean? Her fingers brushed against the broken shards of the earlier mirror still in her pocket. Maybe the answers lay beyond the surface of the mirrors. Gripping one of the shards tightly, Emily pressed it against the edge of the glowing glass. The surface bent and stretched like water, and the shard began to sink through. The house trembled violently as if it could feel her actions. Distant whispers rose to an agonizing crescendo, and then silence. Emily stepped through the mirror, her breath catching as she emerged into what could only be described as a liminal space. The air was thick, the walls lined with what seemed like towering film reels, spinning noiselessly. Scenes from Price's movies flickered on their surfaces, but they were wrong. The faces of the actors twisted into screams that hadn't been in the films, their eyes wide with terror. Price appeared again and again, his expression growing more anguished with each reel. "Emily," a voice called, deep and resonant. She turned to see Price standing in the distance, half in shadow, his face drawn and hollow. "You've crossed the threshold," he said, his voice trembling. "You don't belong here, but perhaps that's why you were chosen." "Chosen for what?" Emily demanded, her voice cracking. "To set us free." Price moved closer, his figure flickering like an old projection. He explained that the house was not merely haunted, it was a prison. Built on land cursed by an old, unspeakable ritual, it trapped the souls of those it consumed. Price himself had become its keeper, forced to lure others into its web through the very art he loved. "Every mirror is a door," he explained, his eyes filled with despair. "But none of them lead out. Not unless—" He trailed off, glancing at the spinning reels. "What do I have to do?" Emily asked, her hands trembling. Price hesitated. "Destroy the reels. Every soul trapped within them feeds the house. But be warned, once you begin, it will fight back. It always fights back." Emily stepped forward, her eyes locking onto the nearest reel. It spun faster as she approached, and the scene it projected grew clearer: a family sitting at a dining table, their faces melting into distorted shadows. The reel burned at her touch, the film sizzling as she pulled it from its spool. A deafening scream filled the air, and the house shuddered as if in pain. Price called out, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "Hurry!" The mirrors in the room began to ripple violently, their surfaces darkening. One by one, hands emerged from them, clawing at the edges. The souls the house had consumed were fighting back, their twisted forms desperate to keep her from succeeding. Emily yanked another reel from the wall, ignoring the searing pain in her hands as it burned away. The room erupted into chaos as the figures from the mirrors began to crawl free, their hollow eyes fixed on her. One of the creatures grabbed her arm, its touch icy and suffocating. Emily screamed, struggling to free herself, but more hands emerged, pulling her closer to the nearest mirror. Price appeared again, his voice urgent. "Don't let them drag you in. You'll become one of them." Summoning every ounce of strength, Emily smashed the shard in her hand against the mirror, shattering it. The creature recoiled, its form dissipating like smoke. But as the mirror broke, the house roared, its walls closing in. The reels began spinning out of control, the images on them flickering faster and faster. Emily knew time was running out. She glanced at Price, who now stood at the far end of the room, his figure fading in and out like a dying light. "Finish it," he cried. Her eyes darted to the largest reel in the room, its size dwarfing the others. She knew instinctively it held the key to the house's power. As she approached it, the air grew thicker, and the floor beneath her feet began to dissolve, revealing an endless void below. Emily stood before the massive reel, the ground crumbling around her. The voices of the trapped souls grew deafening, pleading with her to stop, to turn back. And then she saw herself reflected in a dozen mirrors that had suddenly appeared, each showing a different version of her. One screamed in terror, another begged for help, a third stared back with cold, lifeless eyes. The reel spun wildly, its images blurring together. Price's voice echoed faintly, "Destroy it, Emily, or become part of it forever." But as she reached out, the largest mirror began to ripple behind her, a new figure emerging, one that looked exactly like her, but with a cruel, knowing smile. "Are you sure you're the real one?" it whispered. The room went still, the only sound the reel's rhythmic spinning. Emily hesitated, her hand inches from the reel. Was she freeing the trapped souls or damning herself to take their place? The figure that emerged from the mirror, identical to Emily in every way, stood behind her, its smile widening with an unsettling slowness. For a moment, Emily stood frozen, her heartbeat loud in her ears. The figure's eyes glinted with something dark, something familiar. "Do you really think you can save them?" the doppelganger whispered, her voice a hollow echo of Emily's own. Emily spun around, her breath catching in her throat, but the mirror behind her reflected nothing but the swirling darkness of the room. The figure was gone. Her hands shook as she reached for the giant reel, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. "Destroy it," Vincent's voice urged in her mind. "You must destroy the reel, or they will all remain trapped forever." But doubt gnawed at her. What if the reel was the only thing keeping the house from swallowing her whole, from trapping her forever like the others? Before Emily could act, the ground beneath her quaked again. The reels began to spin faster, the images on them becoming a blur of faces, some familiar, others completely foreign. Faces of people she had never seen, some in agony, some laughing, and others with eyes that were wide open but seemed completely unaware of their own suffering. In the center of it all, she saw Price again, but this time he wasn't alone. Beside him stood a shadow, tall and faceless, and as the figure reached toward him, Price recoiled, his face filled with terror. The shadow loomed larger, darkening the entire room, and then the images on the reels began to distort. The faces of the trapped souls warped into grotesque forms, their eyes no longer pleading but burning with rage. A low, guttural growl filled the room, and Emily's pulse quickened. The house was changing. "Emily," Vincent's voice whispered again, but this time it sounded distant, as though coming from deep within the walls. "You have to understand, there's no escaping this place. No matter what you do, it will find a way to keep you. You're part of it now just as much as they are. You're part of the story." As the walls of the room seemed to close in, Emily noticed something new. The mirrors were no longer showing reflections. Instead, they displayed visions, glimpses of other lives, moments that weren't hers. In one, she saw herself as a child, standing alone in a dark room, staring into a mirror that seemed to grow larger with every passing second. In another, she saw herself as an adult, sitting across from Vincent Price at a dinner table, the two of them discussing something she couldn't quite remember. But in the final reflection, Emily saw herself in the mirror she had just passed through. This time, however, she wasn't alone. The reflection of her doppelganger was standing right beside her, smiling as she watched Emily's every move. The realization hit her like a cold wave. This other version of herself had always been there. It wasn't just an apparition. It was her, or rather, a twisted reflection of what she could have been if she had chosen a different path, if she had made different decisions along the way. "You don't belong here," Emily muttered to the reflection. The figure's smile faltered, and it took a step closer, its eyes darkening with something unspoken. It raised a hand, as if to touch her. Emily recoiled, her heart racing as the figure moved closer. The air around her grew heavier, the walls pressing in tighter. The whispers of the trapped souls grew louder, a cacophony of voices urging her to act. "Destroy it! Break the cycle!" But there was something in the voice of the doppelganger that made her hesitate. It was too familiar, too tempting. "Why do you fight this?" the reflection asked, its voice soft, coaxing. "You know you belong here. This place doesn't trap you. It makes you stronger. It gives you purpose." Emily's thoughts spun. She was no longer sure if the reflection was a warning or an invitation. The shadows seemed to stretch, and for a moment, the boundary between the real world and this nightmarish space began to blur. The mirrors, the house, even Vincent's voice, it all felt like part of the same twisted tale. Was it really possible to destroy the cycle? Was the real the key to salvation or the path to more suffering? Suddenly, the floor beneath her feet cracked, the room spinning violently as the mirrors began to shake with an unnatural force. From the shadows emerged a new figure, tall, faceless, its presence more oppressive than anything Emily had encountered before. Its hands reached for her, and it spoke in a low, guttural tone. You are the last. The story ends with you. In that moment, Emily realized what Vincent had meant when he said she was part of the story. The house didn't just trap souls, it used them to fuel its existence. She was being pulled into the narrative, and no matter what she did, the ending had already been written. The question was no longer about escaping. It was about how she would end the story. And as the figure loomed closer, its cold breath washing over her, Emily felt the weight of the truth press down on her chest. She was the final chapter. She had become a part of the house, and the house would never let her leave. But could she change the ending? Could she break free from the story that had trapped her? Or had she, too, become nothing more than another soul caught within the haunted walls of the ghost palace? As the figure loomed over Emily, its cold fingers brushing her skin, she felt the pull of the house grow stronger. The walls closed in around her, and the mirrors began to distort further, their images warping into grotesque, agonizing faces. She realized the truth. The house was alive, feeding on the stories of those trapped within it, and she had become part of its eternal cycle. With a sudden surge of desperation, Emily grasped the shattered shard of mirror still clutched in her hand and drove it into the heart of the massive reel. The room screamed in agony as the images on the reels flickered wildly, faces of the trapped souls twisting in horror. For a brief, fleeting moment, the house fell silent, as if holding its breath. Then, with a final, deafening crack, the reel disintegrated into dust. The mirrors shattered, the shadows retreated, and Emily felt the weight lift, the oppressive air of the house finally dissipating. As the ground beneath her began to crumble, she looked around one last time, her eyes meeting the reflection of Vincent Price in the broken glass. His ghostly figure nodded once, his face filled with sorrow but also a sense of relief. Emily ran, and for the first time since entering the ghost palace, she heard the front door creak open, the outside world welcoming her back. But as she stepped out into the cold night, she couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, hidden deep in the shadows, the house was already waiting for its next visitor. The story, after all, never truly ended. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Any coincidences with real events or characters are accidental.